morning, everybody. I'm Simon Jackman, Professor of Political Science and the Chief Executive Officer of the United States Study Centre here at the University of Sydney. And before I begin, I pay my respects to the Gadigal people, the custodians of the traditional custodians of the land on which the University of Sydney stands. I pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. Today, we're discussing the future of US defense strategy in the Indo-Pacific, a topic perhaps of no greater interest to our foreign policy and defense team here at the United States Study Centre, and of course, a huge topic for the Australian Strategic Affairs community and the US Strategic Affairs community for that matter. And today's event will be run by the director of the Centre's Foreign Policy and Defence Program, and of course that's Ashley Townsend. But our special guest joining us from Washington, DC is Michèle Flournoy, who is co-founder and managing partner of West Exec Advisors, and of course, perhaps better known to the Australian Strategic Affairs community as the former co-founder and chief executive officer of CNAS, the Centre for a New American Security, where she continues to serve on the board. And also, Michèle served as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy from February 2009 to February 2012. She was the principal advisor to the US Secretary of Defense in the formulation of national security and defense policy, oversight of military plans and operations, and playing a key role in, of course, National Security Council deliberations. Michèle also led President Obama's transition team at the Defense Department. We are so delighted at this particular moment, so close to an intense American presidential election, to have Michèle's time this morning, giving us her insight on what is such an important topic, and one that, of course, suffice to say, remains, I think, strategic issue number one in the Australia-US relationship, irrespective of the election outcome, a topic of intense interest, and as no doubt we will get into in just a moment. Ashley, thank you for putting this event together today. I'm going to hand over the balance of our time today to you, but thank you again, Michèle. Thanks everybody for joining us. I so look forward to the next 56 minutes.
Simon, thank you so much for that introduction. And Michèle, again, from me, thank you for taking the time this evening, Washington, DC time, to be with us here at the US Study Centre for what is, I think, going to be a really interesting discussion.
Well, it's great to be with you all and looking forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Thanks, Michèle. Look, I thought we'd begin today's conversation by rewinding a couple of years to the launch of the National Defence Strategy Commission's report that made for quite dire reading here in the Indo-Pacific, but in many ways globally. The Commission argued that the United States was facing a crisis of national security and could no longer be sure of its capacity to win a future war with Russia or China. Now, the Commission is a group of former defense officials, military leaders, leading strategists, argued that it was a combination of the enduring wars in the Middle East, the constrained defense budgets that had been in place for some time, a decline in US military readiness, and also insufficient modernization of the armed forces over the years. Those four factors that had led the military to become ill-equipped to defend the totality of America's global security commitments in an era of emerging major power competition. And some other analysts have called this variously a crisis of strategic insolvency, or a problem between the means and the ends of American strategy. So I thought we'd begin the conversation by asking, what's your take on some of these dire pronouncements? And do you think there's been progress over the last couple of years? And after the election, how might a Biden administration address some of these apparent shortfalls and problems between aligning strategies and resources?
So I think the Commission's conclusion was sort of meant to be a wake-up call. It was meant to really kind of shake people by the shoulders and say, wake up, all is not well in the world of defense. Because we really were in the midst of a fundamental shift of focus from 20 years of focus on counterterrorism and counterinsurgency in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and globally conducting counterterrorism operations, to now the return of sort of great power competition with a rising China as kind of the pacing threat, if you will, but also very real concerns about our ability to deter Russia, particularly in the gray zone. And so this was an effort to sound the alarm, if you will, to wake people up. And I do think that message has been received by the Pentagon leadership, civilian and military. I think there is a great sense of urgency that, frankly, you saw enshrined in the National Defense Strategy that Jim Mattis put out when he was secretary. And the basic conclusion is that, you know, this is a new era with new challenges. We have a military that's optimized for the past 20 years, not the future 20 years. And if we just simply carry out, you know, the defense program with the current kind of inertia, over time, our ability to deter and defeat aggression in Asia-Pacific will erode. I don't think we're at that point yet, I want to be clear. But I think the risk will grow over time unless we do some things differently. And so, you know, I've just written a piece for CNAS called Sharpening the Edge, which basically argues that we are losing our technological and military edge unless we are to make changes. Deterrence is the name of the game. These are, you know, the United States, China, two nuclear powers. Neither one wants to go to war with the other, but it's quite possible that we could miscalculate, and particularly that Beijing could miscalculate and either underestimate US resolve or our capabilities, and we could find ourselves stumbling into a conflict that nobody actually wanted. So the key is how to sharpen the edge. And for me, it is really a question of, look, we've made major investments in a whole number of legacy systems, from aircraft carriers to joint strike fighter programs to other systems. What are the key emerging technologies that we need to integrate into the force to give us the operational edge, the decision-making edge? And we can talk about what some of those might be. But to me, that's really the key, is accelerating the adoption of new technologies into the force with speed and at scale. That is the long pole in the tent in the next 5 to 10 years, in my view.
Well, let's drill into that a little bit more, Michelle. When it comes to the hard choices or the trade-offs that people argue need to be made, they generally consist of a couple of buckets. There's, as you just mentioned there, the trade-offs that the Pentagon really needs to make, along with the military services, between focusing on legacy systems that are available now, between updating legacy systems that are available now to deal with the short-term horizon, the now to 5 to 10 year horizon, where it's just not the case that bespoke and advanced new military technologies will be available and in the field. And then later on, there is the need to bring into the force and to integrate and experiment more quickly more advanced technologies, leveraging new and emerging science and technology in the United States and allied countries to give an enduring competitive edge. There's also a set of other hard trade-offs, which we can come to in a moment, that have to do with strategic policy, but focusing first on those, if you like, that are within the building, within the Pentagon. How do you think the COVID-19 crisis, as it's evolved and affected the overall US economy and the overall US budget, as well as the defense budget, how do you think that's going to affect this ability to make those hard trade-offs? Is it going to pose any opportunities for the United States to reinvest in this sort of economic and technological basis of American power now in the 5-10 years into the future? Or is it really going to sort of strengthen those constraints on decision-making?
Given the severity of the COVID crisis here that we still do not have under control, the economic recession that it has induced, the range of unmet needs that it's created on the domestic policy side, particularly for people, lower income folks and people who aren't fully caught by the social safety net here, there will be downward pressure on the defense budget, no matter who wins the election. The Trump administration, in starting to develop its 22 budget, has already indicated a flattening or decline of the budget. I think you would see the same for, if Vice President Biden were to come in. And let me just say, qualifier, I am speaking, only for myself here. I have no official role in the campaign or the transition, so I am not speaking for the Biden campaign. But my sense is that you'll see a flattening of the budget because of the very real and visible nature of the challenges we face, whether it's China or Russia or proliferation, or Iran or what have you. I think there's a certain floor for defense spending. I don't think we're going to see draconian cuts in defense spending. But we will see fewer resources, which means there will be tough trade-offs. So I like to say it's not about how much it's not about spending more, it's about spending smarter. And I do think there are times when the budget pressure actually forces the trade-offs that need to be made strategically, but are very difficult to make politically, particularly on Capitol Hill. So I'm optimistic that the department can make those trade-offs and can move in the right direction, can place some big bets on things like integrating artificial intelligence, creating a joint all-domain command and control network of networks, really doubling down on unmanned systems in the air, on the sea, under the sea, and so forth, to augment our manned systems, human-machine teaming that give us much greater capacity than we have with just manned platforms. And there's a long list of these things, but I think those investments are possible even within a flattening budget, and that they're necessary to move us forward in the right direction.
Some of those changes and investments and transformations, really, of the military, we've been talking about for some time. I think one of our mutual friends and one of your former colleagues, Bob Work, was in many ways the brainchild of the third offset strategy, which was an attempt during the Obama administration to do exactly what you just outlined. And of course, it encountered fiscal crunch, and it encountered congressionally mandated caps on defense spending. We're now in a period where you may have an incoming administration that is championing those ideas. And I think it's probably fair to say that there are some in this administration as well that champion those ideas. Will Roper, for example, has been one that is working initially at the Strategic Capabilities Office to do tailored investments into updated technologies for existing and legacy platforms to make them more appropriate for an era of strategic competition. So there have been some efforts, but again, what are those trade-offs when it comes to the fact that the US national deficit is now approaching 100% of GDP and will reach that target according to the Congressional Budget Office in the next couple of years. When you couple that with the fact that the architects of the National Defense Strategy call for 3 to 5% real growth to implement it, it does seem from the outside that something has to give. I'm wondering what that something might be. And you've previously talked about how non-defense investments in the United States economic and technological base writ large might, and these are my words, to a certain extent allow the US to kill two birds with one stone, to reinvest in 21st century technologies, but also to begin the process or to strengthen the process of domestic innovation that will percolate through to defense. Could you comment a little bit on that vision, on that agenda, and how that can proceed in this fiscal environment?
Yeah. Well, I think, if you look at the China-US competition, it is multidimensional in character. There's an economic component, a technological, race, a military component, even a political influence, kind of which model of governance is going to sort of become more dominant in the region. And if you have that perspective, then I think the view I have is that the first thing you have to do, what's most important, is invest in the drivers of American competitiveness, economic and technological, here at home. So invest in science and technology and STEM education. Invest in research and development in key technology areas where we need to have an edge. Invest in 21st century infrastructure. Adopt a smart immigration policy where we attract the best and brightest from around the world, and then we welcome them to stay. If you look at the founders in Silicon Valley, half of them are either immigrants or first-generation Americans. We need that sort of brain power to come to the United States to fuel our innovation ecosystem. So there's a whole host of domestic and economic policies that you can put in place that will be tremendous for accelerating our economic recovery and resilience, but will also provide the foundation and the basis for keeping our edge in the security domain and the technology domain as well.
I want to go now, Michelle, back to the issue of hard choices in a slightly different direction, and that's to the hard choices and trade-offs that might need to be made in terms of strategic policy and the United States global defense commitments. I think well, you wrote recently in Foreign Affairs, actually, that Washington hasn't delivered on its promised pivot to Asia, and you noted that US troop levels in the region remain similar to what they were a decade ago. I might also add here that many Asian allies and partners sort of recall unfavorably the Obama administration's slow action in the South China Sea, even as they welcomed the administration's sustained diplomatic focus on US allies and regional institutions. But there is a concern that in this context, in the context of the need to make hard trade-offs, that a future Biden administration might not be as committed to the Indo-Pacific as and a similar outcome happen as per the pivot to Asia, which never really materialized in its full complexity. Now, you weren't in the Pentagon at the time of the pivot. I think you'd left sort of right as it was, just after it was announced, certainly before the island building in the South China Sea really took off. But you were in a position to have a bit of a sense of why some of those decisions that the Pentagon made didn't come through to full fruition. Why do you think that the Obama pivot didn't happen completely? And do you think that the objectives behind the pivot will return and be embraced by a Biden administration?
Well, I think one of the principal things that undercut the Obama administration's intent for the pivot, not just military, but economic, but diplomatic, full sort of, a major reallocation of strategic focus, was the Budget Control Act. When Congress basically took $500 billion out of defense, and as well as cutting other discretionary accounts like the State Department over a 10-year period. So it was just like having the rug pulled out from under the strategy. And we had to go back to the drawing board in 2011, 2012 to do a revised and less ambitious strategy. That said, I think the sense that Asia Pacific, the Indo-Pacific, will be the region that has the greatest impact on the security and the prosperity and well-being of Americans for the next 50 years or more, I think that sense is still there. And there's actually a fair amount of bipartisan consensus around that. So the question is, how can we be more effective in the region? And I think for me, the first thing is we have to show up again. We have to show up diplomatically. We have to make sure that all of our important diplomatic posts are full and filled with competent people. We need to show up in regional fora. We need to be leading in, various bilateral and multilateral groupings. We were talking earlier about the Quad meeting that just happened, a very important forum. So we need to show up. We need to have a strategic approach with our allies that really sits down and says, look, the only way we're going to handle or address the challenging parts of China's rise is together. US strategy towards China has to be by, with, and through allies and partners. And that means sitting down with each individual country and saying, let's look, taking stock, what are our shared interests? What are our shared values? Where can we cooperate in a way that's going to meaningfully improve your own ability to defend your own sovereignty and interests, but also make us all better contributors to coalition operations when they need to occur? What's the right division of labor for freedom of navigation operations, for example? How do we work these issues together? So I think there's a lot more that could be done to make more use, better use, more strategic use of our alliances and partnerships in the region. And I do think that, you know, speaking of trade-offs, I do think that one of the things that will happen in a new administration, if there is one, from the start, is a global posture review. Where do we have forces deployed? Where do we have assets deployed? Where is the tempo being eaten up every day? And is that posture really aligned with our interests and the strategy? And if not, let's make some adjustments. You're never going to have enough to have no risk. You know, the fun part of strategy is setting the priorities. The hard part of strategy is deciding where you're going to accept and manage a degree of risk. And there will be certain geographies where we need to accept more risk in order to put more focus and attention on Asia.
That really, I think, gets to exactly the heart of this issue on strategic policy trade-offs. And of course, the other thing people say when they're talking about strategy is, if you want to talk strategy, talk budgets, talk prioritizations, talk risk in those terms. I think an issue here for discussion is the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. Now, for our audience who may not be aware of all of the wonky details of what happens in the Pentagon and Congress, the United States, for the last few years, has invested at the behest of Congress in a European deterrence initiative, which was originally, if I'm not mistaken, one of the brainchilds of the late Senator John McCain. Now, the European Deterrence Initiative was designed to strengthen US forward posture, as well as US capacity to operate with allies and partners in Europe. And at the moment, it stands at about $4.5 billion per year in terms of that investment. Congress is now instigating another push to shepherd through, if you like, a similar initiative for the Indo-Pacific. And indeed, the United States Indo-Pacific Command, which is the military command located in Hawaii and responsible for this part of the world, the part of the world in which Australia lives, Indo-PACOM has pushed for the kinds of investments that a Pacific deterrence initiative could bring to the Indo-Pacific: investments in posture, investments in advanced capabilities and experimentation with allies, investments in critical enablers, things like munitions and fuel stock, hardened and distributed bases, etc. in the region. Even though the price tag on the Pacific Deterrence Initiative at the moment is quite low, in the vicinity of, I think, $300 million in year one, which is a lot smaller than the European Deterrence Initiative. To us in the Indo-Pacific, it does look like a good start. So my question, by way of long preamble, Michèle, is do you think the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, given that it currently has bipartisan support, is something that a future Biden administration would pick up with, would run with, would invest in, as a way of starting to address the problems that you've identified in the Indo-Pacific deterrence piece?
I would certainly hope so. Again, I think the name of the game is strengthening deterrence and doing that together with our allies and partners. And I think, you know, I think even just having the initial incarnation of this is very important. And as we, you know, as the US sits down with its allies and partners and does capability assessments, really understand, you know, where are the gaps, what's needed, how do we, you know, help fill those gaps, then I think the opportunity to grow that fund and to grow the level of effort is certainly there. You know, part of my job as Undersecretary of Defense was doing a lot of bilaterals, and I was always frustrated with the fact that we didn't have a sort of strategic multi-year approach to much of our security assistance and cooperation with the smaller countries in the region. It was a lot of one-offs, a lot of, oh, we're interested in this shiny object or that, you know, new platform, but we really didn't have a shared plan of what are we trying to achieve together over the next 5 to 10 years, steadily working away to get to a different end state. And how do we, you know, leverage things like the Pacific Defense Initiative, things like our security assistance, our foreign military financing, our foreign military sales, our exercises, all the things that we're doing together, how do we leverage those to actually strategically move towards a different end state? Whether that's, you know, a country like Vietnam having better maritime domain awareness and able to better protect its own sovereign waters, Whether, you can work through different possibilities, but I think a more strategic approach is absolutely what's needed. And I'm really pleased to see this initiative getting started.
In terms of the role of allies and partners, both in this initiative, but also I think probably more broadly in sort of US military and strategic planning for the Indo-Pacific and operations in the Indo-Pacific, the concept of collective defense or federated defense has really gained traction in recent years. I think you've referred to in your piece in Foreign Affairs an idea that might be called collective defense, insofar as the US needing to work closely with allies to find, enhance and cooperative ways to respond to regional challenges and distribute roles and responsibilities. Many others have, in a similar way, pointed to the need to do this in light of, frankly speaking, in light of an acknowledgement that the United States won't over time have the capacity and probably won't have the credibility to single-handedly uphold the regional balance of power in the Indo-Pacific without greater and focused and coordinated contributions from allies and partners. I think this is something that here in Australia we understand very well. I would probably also argue that Australia and Japan are at the forefront of efforts by US allies to work with Washington towards this kind of strategy. In Australia's new Defence Strategic Update, which is primarily focused on what Australia can do independently in terms of contributing to deterrence and contributing to shared US-Australia security objectives in the Indo-Pacific, is one marker of the seriousness with which this country is taking the need to step up in a context of constrained resources and harder strategic challenges. So I want to maybe press you a little bit more to think about what are some of the options for countries like Australia and Japan as we start to think about implementing a strategy of collective defense. For Vietnam, for the Philippines, for India, countries that are either smaller or more on the front line, less developed militaries or non-allies, there's a certain set of requirements. But for Australia and Japan, we can probably do quite a lot together. What do you think some of those things might be?
Yeah, well, I was going to say, I agree that I think the US-Australia relationship is probably furthest down the road in exploring this concept of how we can approach, have a common approach, but have a fairly explicit division of labor in some areas. So I think, I think there's certainly an operational component to this, and for things like sustaining a steady tempo of freedom of navigation operations, or a steady tempo of, of exercises in a given area or what have you. There's also, I think, partner capacity building aspects where for some of the smaller states, sometimes maybe dividing, the labor in terms of we're going to focus more on one, Australia will focus more on another in terms of training, assistance, advising, even perhaps equipping. But there are also times when we're both working with a partner and we want to make sure that that's synergistic, that we're not pulling them in different directions, but we're actually, our efforts are additive and mutually reinforcing. And then there's at the much more a strategy level, I think, really looking at ways that we together can try to push for things that would reduce risk. So for example, we don't have a real risk reduction framework with China. We don't have an incidents at sea agreement. We don't have the kinds of measures that were put in place back in the days of the US-Soviet tensions and the risk of miscalculation leading to some kind of inadvertent conflict. But that's a place where, again, this is not something that I think will be well received if it's just the US approaching China. I think a number of countries need to approach China together to say, look, the risk is too high. We need to agree on some standards, some norms, some procedures to reduce the level of risk in miscalculation.
Michelle, when it comes to setting those agendas for countries like Australia, I think it's probably fair to say two things. One is that moving to a future where the United States or Indo-Pacific Command relies more heavily on critical enablers provided by countries like Australia and Japan, would be a new development. Of course, we've done this in the Middle East. Australia's wedge tails, for example, have been integrated into multinational coalition operations in a plug and play sort of way, where the flags weren't important. We were all part of a single, if you like, military machine at an operational level working together. But we haven't done that in the Indo-Pacific, certainly not yet. We are moving towards building the integration capacity for that. And I note recently there were advanced Australia-US air sea integration exercises held in Guam, which were a part of that process. But it is something new, and is also something potentially uncomfortable for both sides. On the US side, because as a global military, it's accustomed to not having to rely on other countries and the political and operational risk that can come with that. And on the side of Australia or other countries in the region, the sense of being drawn into or entangled into, broader, larger ally strategic plans in the region is a perennial challenge for small allies, and one that, of course, countries like Australia would want to have greater say and input in, which is itself a difficult process. Are you confident that there's sufficient awareness of these issues and more importantly, willingness to try and work through them to nut out this collective or federated approach to deterrence and defense in the region?
I think it will depend on, who the next administration is, unfortunately, but I do think there's a very strong desire for deeper consultations and to explore this question of, division of labor, in operations, yes, in building capacity, yes, whether it actually gets to, okay, you'll build this capability so we don't have to, or you'll field that capability so we don't have to. I think there'll probably be less of that, just because there may be situations where the US is going to get involved and Australia won't, and vice versa. And so, even with in our closest moments of relationship with the UK, there was some reluctance to sort of not have a US capability. There was a point I remember back in the bottom-up review where we said, should we just count UK brigades, ground force brigades, so that we don't have to build that many? And even in the height of the closeness of that relationship, there was had said, no, these are two sovereign governments. You can't assume that they will come to see every operation the same way we do, even though that's been the history for the most part. I think there's a huge amount of opportunity, though, in the technology area, in trying to, as we go down the road of some of these new areas, investing together, developing together, testing together, fielding. I think that's really important to interoperability, but there's a huge amount of synergy. There's some early recognition of this. In-Q-Tel, which is the kind of the venture capital arm of our intelligence community, has started to make investments in Australian companies just in the last year or two, recognizing that there's a lot of this that we can perhaps accelerate our progress as allies if we invest together. So I would put a lot of emphasis on the technology piece.
Yeah, I think that's a great point on In-Q-Tel, and of course, we at the US Study Centre have been engaged with them since they've been operating here in Sydney as well as in Canberra, and that's a really important initiative. Another important initiative, and I'm going to start to pivot here, ladies and gentlemen, to the question part of today. So I can see some questions coming into the chat, and I've got some pre-submitted questions that I'm going to start sampling from now. The other part, Michelle, of the technology integration piece, and where there is opportunity for the United States and Australia in particular, is through the National Technology and Industrial Base. Now, again, this is going back to the end of the Obama administration, where this thinking began. I think it was 2 years ago that Australia was brought into the NTIB, as it's called. And for our viewers, the NTIB is really an attempt to create a two-way defense industry zone between the United States, Australia, Canada, and Britain, so that, if you like, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and we can share technologies, we can use each other's developments, we can play to our respective strengths in order to more quickly compete with not just China, but more quickly compete with the speed at which technology is advancing and percolating into the military. Now, the reason I bring up the NTIB, Michelle, is it's often looked at as an example of a really good idea that doesn't get the political will it needs to come to full fruition. Because as you will know much better than I, over the last couple of years, although the NTIB has managed to initiate, I think, one important program with Australia, which is a Pentagon contract for the supply of critical minerals to DoD. Beyond that, it has suffered from export controls, from ITAR regulations, from a sense in Congress, not a sense of Congress, but a sense in Congress that the United States, particularly in this administration, needs to rely on a Buy American approach to defense industry, defense technology broadly. And actually, there's a bill in the House at the moment, which is somewhat concerning, which would increase that Buy American provision for DoD to 100%, being pushed through or being examined right now in the Senate, in the House rather. So my question here is, how can the US and Australia do better to make things like the NTIB a reality? What sort of changes do you think might be possible?
Well, I think that you're right to note there is a very strong protectionist sentiment in some quarters of actually in some parts of both parties, Republican and Democrat, and particularly post-COVID, and when there's so much concern about economic recovery, there's a strong sentiment of, we need to onshore more manufacturing, onshore more of our supply chains. But I do think this moment where everyone in the United States is concerned about our reliance on China in certain supply chains, first and foremost defense, national security related, but now also certain aspects of the medical and pharmaceutical supply chains in the wake of COVID. So I do think this moment of where those supply chains are going to get very close scrutiny, it is an opportunity to examine when it's not workable or not affordable or not optimal to actually try to bring that back to the United States because for whatever reason, that sector it may be difficult for us to be competitive in that sector or what have you. Onshoring or reshoring to allies is the next best thing, right? And so I would be very interested in looking at, are there things that we rely on China for that we need to reshore to Australia or to other partners in the region, like a Vietnam or whatever, but countries that we have greater trust with, countries that we know won't use our economic dependencies as a method of coercion against us when we have political disagreements and so forth. So I do think perhaps there's an opportunity to refresh this initiative because of the supply chain concerns and see if there's some particular opportunities in this moment to maybe reinvigorate or expand or build on some of the US-Australia cooperation on the industrial base side.
I should note there that that question that you've just responded to, Michelle, with regards to the how the US and Australia can do more to sort of disentangle supply chains on critical minerals and technology, was from Jim Caruso, the former acting head of mission, the US Embassy here in Australia, and now at Bauer Group Asia. I want to turn again to another aspect of the NTIB and the technology partnership. And this is picking up on questions from my colleague, Brendan Thomas-Noon at the US Study Centre, and our mutual colleague down at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Michael Shoebridge. And it has to do with the capacity in terms of policy initiatives for the US and Australia to get to a point where Australia can co-produce advanced munitions here on this continent, potentially under license from US companies, in ways that would play to the mutual advantages, not just of strengthening resilience in the technological basis of both countries, but I think importantly, in going back to our discussion about the Western Pacific strategic balance, having a stock of supplies and a capacity to produce something like advanced munitions, not in Guam or not in Hawaii, rather, or in continental United States, but here in Australia, much closer to where tensions may flare up, and certainly in part of the world that is still in many ways outside of the range of some of China's medium-range ballistic missiles, etc., could be also very, very important from a military resilience perspective as well, from a logistics perspective as well. So do you think that sort of initiative, which I know has been something that different stakeholders on both sides of the Pacific have been interested in, do you think that's something that could get off the ground in, say, a future Biden administration?
Well, again, I can't speak for a Biden administration, but I can say that I personally think that it's an idea that's worth exploring. And I think the politics of it are challenging, but because of industrial interests. But I think in particularly if it was done through an industrial partnership between an Australian firm and an American firm, that might pave the way. It's not, these things are not impossible. When you think about the SM-3 missile that our Navy uses, which is a critical munition now for us, or a critical missile deployed throughout the US Navy, that was a co-development with Japan. And it was very complicated to work through all the details, but it was a very successful example of what can be done. So I know what you're talking about is a little bit different, but I think it is worth exploring. And I think it is worth trying to create the right incentive structure for both sides to see it as a win.
Ladies and gentlemen, can you please continue to send through your questions to me in the chat? I'm trying to get to as many of those as I can. I don't think I'll get to all of them, but please do send them through, and wherever possible, I'll pull questions so that we can air them now with Michèle. Michèle, I want to turn now to another question from some in the audience. And this is going back to sort of larger issues of deterrence. And it's from Ewan Graham at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. He's asked you to speak a little bit more about the role of nuclear weapons in US deterrence posture, especially with regards to China. He notes that Joe Biden has suggested that he wants to see a reduced emphasis on nuclear weapons, which I think is consistent with where the Obama administration was as well, but not necessarily where this administration is. But is this realistic, he asks, given the constraints that are placed on US conventional capabilities? And if so, what does that mean for the stability of deterrence in the region?
I think that there's a very strong bipartisan commitment to maintaining a strong, secure, safe, reliable nuclear deterrent. And you're about to see the United States embark on an incredibly expensive modernization program of all three legs of the triad. I think a new administration is likely to come in, even if it's a second Trump term, and scrub that modernization plan to see if it can be done more cost effectively. But the commitment to modernizing the deterrent is there. I think when people talk about putting nuclear weapons in the background, I think it means more that we don't want a world in which we are increasing the prominence of nuclear weapons in our strategy, or the likelihood that they would be used early in a conflict and so forth. With regard to China, I think the bigger question is the strategic stability question now encompasses more than just nuclear weapons. It includes, if you look at Chinese military doctrine, the potential for early strikes against assets in space, the potential for early cyber attacks on the US homeland in and around military bases where power would be projected from, the potential use of hypersonic weapons. So there's a broader range of capabilities, nuclear and non-nuclear, that have to be factored into strategic stability talks. And one of the things that's concerned me is that this is the first administration that's had no strategic dialogue with China beyond trade. And even every administration in the United States since Nixon has had strategic stability or strategic talks with the Chinese, whether we were in good times or bad times. We also need those talks because, in addition to talking about the issues we have with them, troublesome issues, we've got to cooperate with China. How do you address climate change without China? How do you address the next pandemic and do a better job of preventing and reducing its its impacts if you don't talk to China? How do you deal with proliferation in North Korea if you don't engage China? So there's a very rich agenda here. And I think you would see, I hope you would see in a Biden administration, that kind of strategic engagement again to address the full range of issues, the areas where we have problems that need to be resolved, the areas where we have differences, but also the areas where we absolutely agree that we need to cooperate.
I'm really glad you went there, Michelle, because again, this issue of the need to both cooperate with China on not only big issues of global governance and international policy, such as climate change or pandemic recovery, and the opportunities for humankind were the US and China to be able to work well together on those challenges, but also for a country like Australia and many US allies in the region, our deep and enduring reliance, I don't think independence is too strong, but reliance on China and China's economy in terms of our trade relationships is also a factor. And again, the world is not as it was during the Cold War, where you could separate it into two blocks. So there will be deep interdependence between our two countries, between all countries, including the US and China. Now that gets us, I think, to a question about how you balance the need to simultaneously strengthen deterrence vis-a-vis China and the credibility of that deterrence through enhanced diplomacy in the region in ways that can ensure that China doesn't see an opportunity to settle some of the scores that it has in its sights in the Indo-Pacific, whether that be Taiwan, other parts of the first island chain, the Senkaku Islands, etc. But at the same time, work with them on these major and important issues of global governance. Of course, major powers can walk and chew gum, but I'm interested in some of your thoughts on how any future administration of any political persuasion should go about juggling those two different and very, in many ways, strained objectives.
I think that the number one risk to deterrence in the near term is China believing its own narrative about the United States, that the United States is in decline. It's withdrawing from the world stage. It's a mess internally. It's divided. It's preoccupied. It still has COVID out of control. And so now's our moment to step up, to step in, to fill the vacuum, to test the limits. That is the greatest danger. So I go back again, the best way to combat that is to show that that's not the case, to get COVID under control, to start reviving our economy with all the investments and competitiveness that I talked about, to show up on the world stage again as a leader with our allies and our partners alongside. And that is the most important thing to give China pause. In addition, we've got to invest in the capabilities that we're going to need to demonstrate that if you do pursue an act of aggression, it will not be successful, or we will be able to impose such costs that it won't be worth it to you. But first and foremost is getting them to question that narrative of US decline. In terms of managing both the tough discussions we need to have with China on areas of disagreement and the areas where, the ability to cooperate. I mean, my own experience is that that's been the name of the game for a long time. When I used to sit down with my counterparts in the PLA, I was instructed to give some very tough messages. But I was also instructed to see if I could deepen cooperation in some areas. I was instructed sometimes to be very transparent about US planning and intent to try to correct some of their assumptions about us that were just plain wrong. And so, this is what diplomacy is. This is what great powers do. You have to be able to cover the full agenda and not paint someone to one corner. It's not just friend or foe, it's competitor and partner in cooperation at the same time. And the name of the game, again, is to prevent that competitor, to manage that competition, in a way that you protect your interests and your allies, but you also prevent that competitor from becoming an outright adversary. Because again, between two nuclear powers, that's a very dangerous situation to be in.
And I think, Michelle, that goes a little bit to looking at the outcome of this year's OSMIN, where in spite of some of Secretary Pompeo's fairly confrontational comments on China, you could see clear intent on the Australian side to cooperate and coordinate with the United States on issues of deterrence and strengthening our defense position, but also play to a different narrative, and a narrative that is, I would argue, speaking personally, much more in tune with what other Indo-Pacific allies and partners actually want, which is to say a productive relationship with China on a range of the issues you've just discussed, as well as a productive relationship with the United States to coordinate, network, and improve our collective approach to dealing with the challenges that China can also present. I want to turn now, in the last few minutes that we have for this, to two questions if I can, but I'll give you the first, Michelle, from our ambassador in in Honolulu, Jane Hardy. Jane Hardy asks that in the next few years, how should a future US administration go about maximizing the effectiveness of the dime in gray zone competition with China? And I think this question maybe goes to the broader context of the need to shape the strategic environment, and to use national defense strategy terms, rather than just prepare for deterrence and high intensity conflict. And shaping, of course, is something which countries of Australia's size are probably far more interested and concerned about doing and doing well than just preparing for when the balloon goes up, so to speak. So how would you go about maximizing the effectiveness of the dime in gray zone competition?
Just to make sure I heard you correctly, DIME is in DIME, diplomacy, information, military, economic.
Sorry, exactly, yes.
Okay. So the first thing I would say is the next administration will have quite a job to do to really rebuild the State Department and rebuild the diplomatic corps and the diplomatic range of instruments. I think that's a critical project. I think it can be done, it will be done. And that will enable us to show up, again, more fully in the region. And I can't underscore how important this is in terms of not only in terms of engaging our bilateral relationships, but also showing up in regional fora, whether that's an ASEAN forum, whether it's the East Asia Summit, whether it is showing up at a standard setting body relative to data and the internet. So we got to show up. I do think that building coalitions of like-minded states to push back on bad behavior when we see it from China is the most effective thing. It's one thing for, a Secretary of State to démarche the Chinese about something. It's another thing when 25 other countries all sign a same statement or all do the démarche together. That's when the Chinese tend to stop and take notice and say, maybe we need to rethink, at least for the moment. So I think it's very important. I think the thing we need to do beyond that is really take a fresh assessment of what do we think China is doing, whether it's the Belt and Road Initiative, whether it's PPP diplomacy, whether it is other instruments they're using to gain influence, toeholds, leverage, and where do we have to care? There's some things that they can find. Go ahead and do that. Be my guest. But there are other things where there needs to be an answer from us as allies. And it may not be symmetric. It may not trying to be offering the same thing or competing for influence in the same way. But we need an answer that is true to our interests and values. And I do think that, that failure to have, what is our answer to BRI? What is our answer to some of these efforts? I think that's a very important piece of strategy work that we need to sit down and try to do together.
Michelle, I couldn't agree more. I think we could go on in this track for another hour or two, and unfortunately we don't have the time. You've encapsulated in your answer to that question, my last one, which actually was a question about the Belt and Road Initiative. So I thank you for that. But I would ask all of you, and on behalf of the US Study Center, to share, to join with me rather, in thanking you, Michelle, for taking the time to speak with us today. Your comments are extremely important, I think, for Australians and others in the Indo-Pacific to hear as we approach the US election. And of course, the wisdom that you bring from your decades of experience in looking at these topics is, I think, something that we'll all take something away from as we think about these issues going forward. So thank you again for taking the time to join us today at the US Study Center, and we wish you all the very best in Washington, DC, as you all move towards approaching the kind of post-pandemic life that we here in Australia are fortunate to be in at the moment.
Well, Ashley, thanks so much for inviting me, and really enjoyed the conversation. Hope everybody out there stays well.
Thank you so much, Michelle. All the best. And ladies and gentlemen, I'll just draw your attention to the next set of events coming up from the United States Study Center in our Election Watch series. Of course, we have next week an In Conversation event with Greg Sheridan, Simon Jackman, and Zoe Daniel on takeaways from the 2020 election and what's at stake for Australia. After that, late next week, we have a very interesting event with the former Chief of Staff to Donald Trump, Mick Mulvaney, in conversation with Australia's former Ambassador to the United States, Joe Hockey. So please, as always, join us for those events. You can subscribe at ussc.edu.au/events. And we thank you so much for taking time to be with us at the United States Study Center online.